Have you ever stopped to think about why, even though we are living in the most prosperous period in human history, so many people around you seem more distressed than ever? Why, in an era where we have instant access to any information, connection with people worldwide, and opportunities our ancestors never dreamed of, is there this growing sense of emptiness, that something fundamental is missing? Perhaps you feel this yourself, that silent restlessness that emerges when digital distractions stop for a moment, and you wonder if you're truly living or just existing on autopilot. You're not alone in this experience, and what you're feeling might be the first sign of something much larger approaching. Imagine for a moment the life of a medieval peasant. He woke with the sun, worked the land, his father and grandfather had worked, knew exactly what his place in the world was, which God to believe in, whom to marry, when to plant, and when to harvest. His life was difficult, certainly marked by scarcity, disease, and early death. But there was something that peasant possessed that we, with all our technology and abundance, have almost completely lost. Absolute certainty about who he was, what his purpose was, and what life expected of him. Every gesture had meaning, every season brought known rituals, every relationship was embedded in a stable social network that had been tested for generations. He might die young, but he knew exactly why he was alive. Now compare this with the experience of a young adult in 2024. He has access to more information than any emperor in history, can instantly communicate with people on distant continents, has career opportunities that didn't exist a decade ago, but every morning he needs to construct his identity from scratch, decide what to believe among thousands of digital influencers, choose among hundreds of career options that might become obsolete before he even graduates, navigate liquid relationships, where even the concept of romantic love is constantly being redefined. He might live to 90, but spends most of his time wondering what the point is of living so long. This is the great transformation of our time, and it's creating the ground for a completely new crisis. While economists and politicians prepare for possible financial collapses, recessions, or trade wars, the real storm approaching won't be measured in GDP or stock indices. It will be measured in rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, and a completely new form of human suffering we're still learning to name: collective existential crisis. For centuries, humanity organized its societies around grand narratives that gave meaning to both individual suffering and collective progress. Religion promised that earthly suffering would be compensated in eternal life. Nationalism suggested that personal sacrifices served the glory of the homeland. Socialism guaranteed that present difficulties were building a utopian future for all. Even capitalism offered its own version of meaning. Work hard, be successful, consume, and you'll find happiness through material progress. But what happens when all these narratives begin to crumble simultaneously? When religion loses relevance for large urban populations? When nationalism reveals itself as an artificial construction that serves more to manipulate than to unite? When socialism fails in its utopian promises? And when capitalism itself begins to produce more anxiety than satisfaction? What remains is an entire generation of human beings who are highly educated, technologically connected, and materially comfortable, but completely lost about what to do with their lives. This isn't a crisis that can be solved with economic policies or institutional reforms. It's a crisis of meaning, and it's deepening every year. Statistics already show the signs. Rising depression rates among young people who theoretically have everything to be happy about, anxiety epidemics in prosperous countries, suicide records among populations with high education and income levels. But this is just the beginning. Technology, which was supposed to liberate us, is accelerating this crisis in ways we've barely begun to understand. Every algorithm that personalizes our digital experience isolates us a little more in our own reality bubble. Every screen-mediated interaction reduces our capacity to form genuine human connections. Every notification that interrupts our focus fragments our capacity for deep contemplation and self-knowledge a little more. We are creating tools too powerful for our current emotional wisdom. Think about the paradox we live in. We have apps that promise to connect us with anyone in the world, but record levels of loneliness. We have access to humanity's entire library in the palm of our hand, but our capacity for concentration is dramatically diminishing. We have medications that can chemically treat depression, but the existential causes of that depression are multiplying faster than our ability to medicalize them. And here lies the true danger of the 2026 crisis. It won't have simple technical solutions. When an economy collapses, we know what to do. We can print money, lower interest rates, create employment programs, restructure debt. When a war threatens international order, we can mobilize armies, form alliances, negotiate treaties. But what do we do when millions of people simultaneously lose the capacity to find meaning in their lives? The answer isn't in more technology, more efficiency, or more economic growth. It might be, paradoxically, in learning to slow down in an era that forces us to constantly accelerate. It might be in rediscovering forms of human connection that don't depend on digital mediation. It might be in creating new rituals and traditions that offer the kind of emotional stability that old institutions used to provide. But perhaps, more importantly still, the solution might be in accepting that we don't need to have all the answers about the meaning of life to live meaningful lives. The medieval peasant had certainties that were largely illusory, built on myths and traditions that wouldn't withstand modern scientific scrutiny. We have doubts that are paradoxically closer to the truth about the complexity of human existence. The emotional crisis approaching might actually be a disguised opportunity, a chance to build a way of living that's more honest about the limitations of human knowledge, more compassionate toward the suffering inherent in existence, and more creative in seeking forms of meaning that don't depend on absolute certainties or promises of permanent happiness. Let me pause for a moment to ask, do you recognize in your own life this constant search for meaning in a world that seems to offer fewer and fewer reliable narratives about how to live? This feeling that despite all the available opportunities, something essential is missing in our collective experience? If these reflections touch on questions you've been carrying, perhaps in silence, know that you're far from alone in this restlessness. Share in the comments. I feel our era lost meaning when your experience might offer valuable insights to others facing the same existential questions, and together we can begin to map the contours of this new crisis before it catches us completely unprepared. Looking toward 2026, we shouldn't expect the symptoms of this emotional crisis to manifest in an organized or predictable way. They might appear as waves of protests that can't clearly articulate their demands, populist political movements that promise simple answers to complex questions, or even as completely new forms of art and culture that express the anguish of a generation lost between worlds. The crucial difference is that this time we'll have the opportunity to face a crisis knowing it's coming. We don't need to wait for millions of people to emotionally collapse before we begin developing psychological resilience, support communities, and sustainable ways of finding purpose. We don't need to wait for traditional institutions to completely collapse before we begin experimenting with new forms of social organization that place emotional well-being at the center of their priorities. Perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that this crisis isn't a sign of humanity's failure, but of success. For the first time in history, we've solved basic survival problems for a significant percentage of the world's population. Now we're free to face deeper questions about what it means to be human, how to find meaning in finite existence, and how to build societies that nourish not just our bodies, but our souls. The emotional crisis of 2026 might be the painful birth of a new phase of human civilization, a phase where we finally learn to integrate our incredible technological capacity with emotional and spiritual wisdom adequate to the complexity of the challenges we've created for ourselves. But this will only happen if we start now the conversation about how we want to live, not just how we want to produce, consume, or compete. If you feel these reflections touched on something important about the challenges we face, both individually and as a society, I invite you to be part of this ongoing discussion. By subscribing to the channel, you'll connect with a community of people who, like you, are seeking to wisely navigate through these extraordinary transformations we're experiencing. We don't offer easy answers because life's most important questions rarely have simple solutions. But we offer a space to explore these essential questions together, collectively building more conscious and compassionate ways of living in this complex and fascinating world we're creating. The crisis is coming, but for the first time in history, we have the possibility of facing it consciously, prepared and united by a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human in an era of accelerated transformation. The issue is that we're living what we could call the great emotional acceleration. While our ancestors had decades to process significant social changes, we face fundamental transformations in how we work, relate, and understand reality every few years. The human nervous system, which evolved to deal with immediate physical threats and stable communities of a few dozen people, is being constantly bombarded by stimuli for which we have no evolutionary preparation. Consider, for example, what it means for a 20-year-old to choose a career today. He's not just choosing a profession, he's betting on what type of human skill will still be valued in an increasingly automated economy. He needs to anticipate which industries will exist in a decade, which competencies artificial intelligence won't be able to replicate, and how to position himself in a job market that could be completely reorganized by technologies that haven't even been invented yet. This isn't just economic pressure, it's constant existential pressure. And this happens simultaneously in all areas of life. Choosing a romantic partner in an era of dating apps means navigating among hundreds of potential options, knowing that both you and the other person have constant access to seemingly better alternatives. Forming a personal identity means choosing among thousands of digital influencers, belief systems, and lifestyles competing for your attention on social media. Even deciding what to eat has become a complex political and moral statement involving considerations about environmental sustainability, animal rights, personal health, and social justice. Our great-grandparents made these choices based on tradition, geography, and social class. Options were limited, but this also meant decisions were simpler and came with community support structures that validated those choices. We have almost infinite freedom of choice, but also almost infinite responsibility for the consequences of those choices, and much less social support to navigate through this complexity. The result is that each individual becomes a perpetual self-development project, constantly questioning whether they're making the right choices, whether they're adequately optimizing their life, whether they're missing better opportunities. Life becomes an infinite series of decisions that need to be constantly re-evaluated and adjusted. It's no coincidence that the word burnout has become so central in contemporary vocabulary. We're not just exhausted from work, we're exhausted from having to constantly be the curators of our own lives. Here enters a crucial aspect that's rarely discussed. Digital technology isn't just changing how we do things. It's fundamentally changing how we experience time and attention. Our brains are being constantly stimulated by notifications, updates, and new content. The capacity to simply be present in a moment without trying to optimize it or document it or compare it with other people's experiences online is becoming increasingly rare. This creates a strange form of temporal alienation. We live simultaneously in the future, constantly planning our next optimization or upgrade, and in the past, constantly consuming content about nostalgia, or comparing our present with idealized versions of how things used to be. The real present, where human life actually happens, becomes increasingly difficult to access. And when we manage to access it, we often discover we no longer know what to do with it. How many times have you had a few free minutes and immediately picked up your phone, not because you had something specific to do, but because the silence of your own mind had become uncomfortable? We are losing the capacity to be alone with our own thoughts, and consequently, losing access to the psychological processes we traditionally used to process difficult experiences and integrate learnings about ourselves. The 2026 crisis won't just be about individuals feeling lost. It will be about the collapse of collective systems that used to help people process emotional difficulties. Traditional institutions of psychological support, extended family, religious communities, local associations, even stable workplaces where people developed lasting relationships, are being rapidly replaced by more superficial and transitory digital connections. When someone faced a personal crisis 50 years ago, there were established social structures to offer support. Extended family gathered, the religious community offered healing rituals and meaning, neighbors provided practical help. Today, a person in emotional crisis often finds themselves alone with their own psychological resources, perhaps with access to professional therapy if they have financial means, but without the informal support networks that historically sustained people through difficult periods. Paradoxically, this happens at a time when theoretically we're more connected than ever. But digital connection isn't equivalent to real emotional support. You can have 1,000 online followers and still feel profoundly alone when facing a real crisis. You can be constantly in contact with people through messages and still have no one you can honestly talk to about your deepest doubts. Even more problematic is that digital platforms often amplify constant social comparison. Every personal experience is unconsciously compared with curated and optimized versions of other people's lives we see online. This creates a completely new form of psychological suffering in human history. The constant feeling that everyone else is living more interesting, more successful, and more meaningful lives than ours. This phenomenon is creating what we might call comparative depression. It's not traditional clinical depression caused by chemical imbalances or specific traumas. It's a subtler, but perhaps more pervasive form of existential dissatisfaction caused by constant exposure to lives that seem more successful than ours. And since these comparisons are based on highly edited representations of other people's reality, it's a competition that's impossible to win. Now imagine this multiplying on a social scale. It's not just individuals facing these pressures. It's entire societies trying to navigate transformations for which we have no historical precedents. The speed of technological change means that solutions that worked for the previous generation became irrelevant before the next generation could even learn them. Educational systems are trying to prepare children for careers that might not exist when they graduate. Political systems are trying to regulate technologies that evolve faster than the capacity to create legislation. Healthcare systems are trying to treat forms of psychological suffering that didn't exist when most treatment protocols were developed. It's in this context that we must understand the 2026 crisis not as an isolated event, but as the moment when these accumulated tensions reach a critical tipping point. It will be the moment when an entire generation that grew up with these pressures reaches full adulthood, assuming leadership positions in a society they perceive as fundamentally dysfunctional. But unlike traditional economic crises, this one can't be solved just with public policies or institutional changes. It will require a transformation in how we understand what it means to live a meaningful human life in an era of accelerated change. The good news is that this transformation is already beginning to emerge in unexpected ways. Global mental wellness movements are creating new vocabularies for discussions about psychological health. Online communities are experimenting with more authentic and less competitive forms of connection. Companies are beginning to recognize that sustainable productivity requires attention to workers' emotional well-being. More importantly still, a new generation of thinkers, artists, and social innovators is emerging with an intuitive understanding that the problems we face require solutions that integrate technological wisdom with emotional intelligence. They're creating art forms that process digital anxiety, developing technologies that promote genuine connection instead of digital addiction, and experimenting with forms of social organization that prioritize collective well-being over economic growth at any cost. The 2026 crisis might be the catalyst that forces humanity to finally confront questions we've been avoiding. How do we want to live? What constitutes a well-lived life in an era of material abundance and scarcity of meaning? How can we use our incredible technological capacity to support human flourishing instead of just economic efficiency? These aren't questions that can be solved by experts or governments. They require an honest collective dialogue about values, priorities, and the kind of future we want to create for ourselves and future generations. I need to pause again and ask, do you feel we're living in a unique historical moment where fundamental questions about how to live are being posed more urgently than perhaps they have been for centuries? Do you perceive in your own experience this tension between the incredible possibilities technology offers and the growing difficulty of finding stable meaning in a constantly changing reality? If these reflections echo your own concerns about the direction of our civilization, share in the comments. I see signs of the 2026 emotional crisis when your perspective might contribute to a deeper collective understanding of the challenges we're facing, and perhaps to solutions that can only emerge when we recognize we're not facing these questions alone. What makes this crisis different from all previous ones is that it's forcing humanity to evolve psychologically at unprecedented speed. We don't have the luxury of centuries to gradually adapt to new realities. We need to develop new emotional and cognitive capacities in real time while navigating the very transformations that are creating the need for these adaptations. This suggests that solutions to the 2026 crisis won't come just from external changes in policies or technologies, but from an internal transformation in how human beings relate to themselves, to each other, and to the purpose of their lives. We are being called to become wiser, more compassionate, and more resilient at a speed that will test the limits of human adaptability. But if we succeed, if we can use this crisis as an opportunity to make this evolution consciously, we might be on the threshold of a completely new phase of human civilization. A phase where we finally learn to live according to our true nature as meaning-seeking beings in harmony with the powerful tools we've created, in a society that nurtures both our individual potential and our collective well-being. The choice is ours, and time is running out. But for the first time in history, we have both the awareness and the necessary tools to make this choice consciously. The question is whether we'll have the courage and wisdom to do it before the crisis forces us into changes that might be much more traumatic than the transformations we could consciously choose today. If you've made it this far in this reflection, you're probably someone who feels the urgency of these questions in your own life. I invite you to join this ongoing conversation about how we can collectively navigate through this extraordinary transformation. By subscribing to the channel, you'll become part of a community of people committed to developing both intellectual understanding and practical wisdom for the unique challenges of our time. Together, we can explore not just the problems we face, but the extraordinary possibilities that open up when we consciously confront the deepest transformation moments in human history. The future we create depends on the conversations we begin today. The most important taboo of the global liberal order was that strong countries cannot just invade and conquer other countries by force of arms just because they are stronger. It has been, I would say, the most amazing political and maybe moral achievement of humankind. And the place to see that it was a reality is in government budgets. You know, people talk about peace and war, and they think about, you know, all these pacifist literature or poetry. Don't read poetry, read government budgets. And government budgets over the last 20 or 30 years have been the most amazing thing to read. More than 80% of the budget of the Roman Empire was spent on soldiers, warships, fortresses, weapons. And this was the situation until the 20th century. In the early 20th century, more than 50% is spent on the military. In the early 21st century, all over the world, taking all countries, the average expenditure went down to between 6 and 7%, compared to 10% average spent on healthcare. It was the first time in human history that governments spent more money on healthcare than on the military. And it was all based on this basic taboo that, okay, there are civil wars, there are revolts, revolutions, we didn't solve all problems. But one thing is off the table. You cannot invade and conquer another country just because you're stronger. And this taboo has now been broken. If you only give a company or an algorithm the goal of increasing production, which in social media means increasing engagement, produce more time spent on the platform, this will not regulate itself. And here we need intervention of government to regulate it. And the two most obvious regulations, first of all, companies should be liable for the actions of their algorithms. The companies constantly try to confuse people by saying this is against free speech. The government wants us to censor our users. And this is, I think, deliberate obfuscation, deliberate confusion. The issue is not what the users are doing. The issue is what the algorithms of the company are doing. If somebody publishes a hate-filled conspiracy theory, at least my personal opinion is that except in very extreme circumstances, it should not be censored and the person should not be punished. The problem is not with the human being who published this hate-filled post. The problem is that the Facebook algorithm or the TikTok algorithm now takes this post and deliberately shows it to millions of other people because it assumes that it will increase engagement. This is the problem. The main promise of AI is to be better than us at decision-making in many fields, that it would be able to invent things that we cannot think about, but that is also the main threat, that we cannot predict how it will behave, and we cannot control it in advance. No matter how much we try to make it safe, to align it with our aims, with our goals, it really goes to the heart of what AI is. It's no longer artificial. If you think about what an artifact is something that we create and we control. With each passing day, AI is becoming less and less artificial, which is why I prefer to think about AI as an acronym for alien intelligence.